This is Chapter 2, History of American Government, Discussion Number 2, American Protests Through America's Revolutionary War Government. With the perceived interference into American government by the English government, many of the colonists started to protest against what England was doing with what they had done for centuries as their own private governing process. First one that we're going to talk about is the Stamp Act Congress. Britain established a stamp tax on all official documents, all business agreements, all newspapers, and even on playing cards. And in order for these to be able to be sold in the British colonies of North America, they had to have the stamp. So when you paid for the stamp, that was the tax. They weren't very happy about this, mainly because let's say that you printed a newspaper that the king did not like. Well, the local representative said, fine, I'm not going to let you have the stamp. And so people realized that this could be a serious curtailing of their individual liberties. Delegates from 9 colonies went to New York. They decided that, maybe the king doesn't really realize what this is going on. After all, it's the Privy Council and the governors who are making the decision. And they wrote up and adopted what they called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, where it's a letter to the king saying, do you know what's going on? Maybe you ought to fix it. And a lot of it was complaining about how things were being handled. A lot of people were upset about the Stamp Act. And then other things started showing up in the rules and the taxation directly by the British government instead of allowing the local governments to do it. And so we ended up with a lot of different things going on, making a lot of people upset. We had the Boston Tea Party after the tea tax, and so after that, the Intolerable Acts were passed as a lot of rules were being made for Boston for dumping all the tea and refusing to pay for it. As Boston was being picked on, a lot of people were saying, we might be next, and so they had the First Continental Congress, which met in Carpenter's Hall in Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, to be more specific. And the delegates then saying again, hey, we keep on getting this screwed up. We keep on getting a bad deal here. They said, hey, we need to go back to the colonies and said no one buys anything that's taxed by Britain. They don't get the money, that'll teach them. They also sent another letter, they call it the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress to King George III, saying we don't like how we're being treated, especially for the fact that we're being taxed, and we don't have anybody in Parliament to say this is a good idea, bad idea. We're just being stuck with the bill, and we don't like the way that is. And after all, aren't we English citizens? Shouldn't we have the same rights as everyone who lives in England? And here we are, we're getting a bad end. So they did that. They also called for the Second Continental Congress the next year because, again, nothing was really happening. Now, the Second Continental Congress was called for. Then Lexington and Concord happened, where British troops fired on Americans as they were going to capture a lot of the munitions that the colonists had stored up, and they were out trying to arrest some of the leaders of the disgruntled people in Boston. And so all of a sudden now we have British troops firing on Americans, and so the Second Continental Congress gets together and they say, we've got real problems, and it looks like about the only way we're going to be able to deal with them is with gunpowder and blood. So the Second Continental Congress happens to be the only group of people who are gathering from all the colonies, getting together. They've made some decisions before. When the First Continental Congress, they decided to write that official document, and now they're together and they're like, hey, we need to start cooperating. We need to have a Continental Army. They chose one guy from their group, stood pretty tall. He wore his old uniform from the French and Indian War, and George Washington was selected to be the leader of the Continental Army. Second Continental Congress also did a lot of other things in order to direct the revolutionary effort by the Americans. They organized and built a navy, which was really not that impressive, but they did it. And John Paul Jones from the American Revolution is one of the more famous characters that we've talked about, hopefully in previous history classes. They borrowed money. Who's going to loan money to a government that most people that thought that the British were going to smash like a bug? But they were able to borrow money, and they did it because they convinced everyone that they were legitimate. So with the money, they bought supplies. They created a monetary system, the Continental. They printed money for people to be able to spend, so they didn't have to be using the British pound, and it created legitimacy for their own government. They were able to come to agreement with foreign powers. Foreign powers actually were willing to deal with them. Of course, we already know about the French. Hopefully, you remember the French. They came and helped us win. Um, they also issued the Declaration of Independence, saying we are now going to be separate from our founding government. Now remember that Lexington and Concord happened in 1775. The Declaration of Independence was written and adopted in 1776. But we didn't really come up with an official way to run the American government until the Articles of Confederation were created by the Second Continental Congress until 1781. So from 1776, when we said we are an independent nation, to 1781, when we actually came up with a written set of rules, they kind of just made it up as they went. But they beat Britain. We won the American Revolution, and so they got some stuff right as they were developing the new American style of government and how they were doing things. This concludes discussion number 2, American protests through Americans' Revolutionary War government.